It is 11:08 p.m. Lucas is lying in bed, phone in his hand. The room is quiet. Nothing urgent is happening, but something feels off. He has been doing everything right for over a year. He has been consistent and disciplined, not missing a single contribution. And still, the number on the screen does not match the effort. It looks small, it looks underwhelming, it looks wrong. After a long pause, the only question that really matters finally forms clearly in his mind, which is whether any of this is actually doing anything at all. Across the city, Kevin is looking at the same app with almost identical numbers. Even though nothing about his situation is different, the feeling is exactly the same. Investing early is not about the numbers. It is about how those numbers feel. What both of them are experiencing is effort without visible reward. It does not explode, it builds quietly over time. And over time, that quiet pressure begins to shape how they think about their decisions in ways they do not fully notice yet. That moment does not feel like a turning point, yet it is. Because most people do not quit after something goes wrong. They quit when nothing seems to be happening. And that creates a specific kind of psychological pressure. Because nothing is broken, but something feels wrong. And that is enough to push people toward decisions that seem reasonable in the moment, but become expensive over time. Lucas and Kevin started in the same place, with the same income, the same opportunities, and the same intention to do something responsible with their money. At 23, they were not trying to beat the system or chase extreme outcomes. They were simply trying to avoid being stuck later, which is why they chose something simple. Committing to invest $500 every month into a basic index fund with automatic transfers. This removed the need to constantly make decisions or second-guess themselves and allowed the process to run without constant interference. At the beginning, the decision itself felt like progress, because taking action creates a sense of control, and control creates the feeling that you're moving forward. But that feeling fades when the system does not respond in a meaningful way, because effort shows up instantly while results take time. And that delay creates a gap that the brain struggles to interpret correctly, especially when that gap persists longer than expected and there is no visible confirmation that anything is actually working. After the first year, both of them had contributed around $6,000. The actual growth was only a few hundred, which technically meant the system was working. But emotionally, it did not feel like progress. It felt like waiting. It felt like sacrificing now for something that was not yet visible. And that emotional mismatch becomes more important than the numbers themselves, because it begins to influence behavior. This is where perception shifts. Because when effort is clearly visible and results are not, the brain starts trying to explain the gap. And those explanations often lead to conclusions that feel logical, especially when compared to immediate alternatives that provide visible benefits. Kevin begins to feel this more strongly over time, not because he lacks discipline, but because he expects feedback from his actions. And when that feedback does not arrive in a meaningful way, it creates a quiet internal dialogue that slowly grows louder. He starts asking himself whether continuing actually makes sense, whether the sacrifice is justified, and whether the system is actually doing what it is supposed to do. And this is where Kevin's real life starts to interfere with the plan in ways that seem small at first, but become significant over time. Because the $500 he is investing every month is not just a number. It is money that could be used elsewhere. Money that could solve small problems, improve his daily life, and reduce friction in ways that are immediately visible. And those trade-offs become harder to ignore the longer the results remain invisible. He notices that his friends are upgrading things around him. Better apartments, newer cars, more frequent trips. And while he knows those choices are not necessarily better long-term decisions, they feel better in the moment. That creates a subtle pressure that builds over time, not as envy, but as doubt. Because he starts questioning whether he is delaying too much for something that might not materialize the way he expects. Lucas experiences the same environment, but he processes it differently. Not because he is more disciplined, but because he is less engaged in the moment-to-moment evaluation of his progress. And that difference reduces the emotional weight of the comparison, allowing him to continue without constantly questioning whether he should adjust his behavior. By the second year, nothing changes emotionally, even though the account is growing, because the growth is still too small relative to the contributions to create a meaningful sense of progress. And this is the phase almost nobody explains honestly, because it sounds counterintuitive, yet it is true. The early stage of compounding does not feel slow. It feels pointless. And that is dangerous because slow feels like progress, but pointless feels like a mistake. Most people don't quit because they fail. They quit because nothing is happening. And they interpret that feeling as a signal that something is wrong, even when everything is working exactly as it should. And that misinterpretation becomes one of the most expensive mistakes in personal finance. By the third year, the account reaches around $20,000, which sounds respectable. But when Kevin looks at it, he does not see growth. He sees that most of the money came from him. And this is where perception overrides reality. Because the system is functioning correctly, but it has not reached a scale where it can prove that in a way that feels convincing. This is the part people underestimate. Because nothing dramatic has happened. Nothing has failed, but nothing has impressed either. And that lack of visible progress creates the exact conditions where people begin to question whether continuing makes sense, especially when the alternative options feel more rewarding in the present. Lucas continues because nothing interrupts him. The system runs automatically, and there is no decision to revisit, while Kevin has to justify the decision every month. And over time, that becomes exhausting. Because repeating the same justification without seeing visible results creates fatigue. And fatigue leads to change. Not because the logic changed, but because the emotional cost of staying becomes too high. By the fourth year, Kevin's attention shifts toward what he is not doing rather than what he is building. And once that shift happens, the $500 a month no longer feels like an investment in the future. It starts to feel like something that is limiting his present. Especially when he compares himself to people around him who are making different choices and seeing immediate outcomes. He is not making a bad decision. He is making a decision that feels right now. And that is exactly why it is expensive later. He tells himself he will restart when things feel more stable. And that narrative allows him to step away without feeling like he is making a mistake. He thinks he is pausing. He is actually resetting the clock. That is exactly how most people leave the process. There is a well-documented behavioral gap identified by Dalbar, showing that the average investor significantly underperforms the market. Not because the market fails, but because people interrupt their own progress. During the exact phase where consistency matters most, Lucas does not interrupt, and that becomes his advantage. Not because he is smarter, but because he stays in the system long enough for it to begin working. By the fifth year, Lucas is approaching $40,000. And while that still does not feel life-changing, something important is forming beneath the surface. Because the base is now large enough that percentage growth begins to matter more, even if it is not yet dramatic. And that subtle shift is the beginning of momentum. Kevin, on the other hand, feels relief in the short term. Because his monthly cash flow improves, his lifestyle feels slightly easier, and that reinforces his belief that stepping away was the right move, which makes it even harder for him to question that decision later. The cost is delayed. You just don't feel it yet. And by the time you do, it is already too late to fix completely. By the seventh year, the gap between them is still small enough to ignore. And that is exactly why it becomes dangerous. Because without visible consequences, there is no reason to question the path you are on. Around the eighth year, something begins to change for Lucas, because the growth starts to feel more responsive. And even though the numbers are not dramatic yet, the system no longer feels completely passive. Nothing changes, until it does. By the 10th year, Lucas crosses $100,000. And this is the moment where something shifts internally. Because the number itself is less important than what it represents, which is proof that the system works, even if it took longer than expected. What makes this moment different is not just the number, but the shift in how the process feels. Because for the first time, it no longer feels invisible. And once something feels real, it becomes easier to continue. Kevin sees this, and for the first time, the question changes. Because he is no longer asking whether it works. He is asking what would have happened if he had stayed. And that question does not go away. It follows him into every future decision. And this is where everything shifts. By the time Lucas crosses into six figures, the system begins to change in a way that is easy to overlook if you only focus on a number. Because what matters is not the milestone itself, but the shift happening underneath it, where the account begins to contribute to its own growth. Slowly at first, then more noticeably over time. For years, every dollar Lucas added felt like the primary driver of progress, and the account itself felt passive, almost irrelevant in the short term. But now something subtle begins to happen, where the growth generated by the account starts to feel like a second contributor. Not yet dominant, but no longer invisible. And that change is enough to alter his perception of what he is doing. A strong year now adds what used to take years to save. And even an average year produces growth that feels real, which changes how the process is experienced. Because it no longer feels like effort without reward. It begins to feel like something that is working alongside him, rather than something that depends entirely on him. Lucas does not change his behavior at this stage. And that is important, because what changes is not the strategy, but his relationship with it. The need to constantly question disappears. The doubt that once appeared every time he opened the app becomes less frequent. And consistency becomes easier, not because it requires less effort, but because it requires less justification. Kevin, meanwhile, is navigating a very different reality. Because even though he has restarted his contributions, even though he is once again trying to follow a similar path, he is doing it from a position that is fundamentally different. Because the base he had earlier is gone, and rebuilding that base feels slower the second time. Not because the math changed, but because the timeline has. He notices this difference in ways that are not always obvious at first. Because on the surface, he is doing the same thing he was doing before. Contributing monthly. Watching the balance increase. Try to stay consistent. But internally something feels different. Because the progress feels delayed again. And this time he recognizes that feeling. And that recognition makes it harder to ignore. By year 12, Kevin is contributing again with more intention than before. Trying to compensate for lost time, increasing his monthly amount when he can, adjusting his spending in small ways. But even as he does that, the growth still feels slower than expected. And that creates a subtle frustration, because he feels like he is putting in more effort than before, but not seeing proportionally better results. This is where a different kind of pressure begins to build. Not the pressure of doubt, but the pressure of awareness. Because Kevin is no longer questioning whether the system works. He is starting to understand that it does, but that he interrupted it at the exact moment when it needed time the most. And that awareness changes how every future decision feels. And his account is now generating more growth per year than he contributes, which means the system is starting to carry him. Not completely, but enough that the balance begins to feel like it has its own momentum. While Kevin is around $25,000 to $30,000, having restarted and contributed again, but never rebuilding the base he once had. He restarted, he contributed again, but he never rebuilt the base. He is not behind. He is on a different path now. That gap is no longer small. It is permanent. Kevin begins to notice patterns in his own life that he did not connect before. Because every time he tries to accelerate, something pulls him back. Expenses increase. Responsibilities grow. Unexpected costs appear. And the idea of catching up begins to feel less realistic. Even though he continues to try. He works longer hours, takes on more responsibility, focuses on increasing his income. But the difference is that time is no longer on his side in the same way. And that difference becomes more visible with each passing year. By year 20, Lucas is approaching $400,000. And most of that growth is now coming from compounding rather than contributions. while Kevin is around $60,000 to $70,000. Still progressing, but now working against time rather than with it. Effort cannot replace lost time. It never could. By year 25, Lucas is somewhere between $600,000 and $700,000, and his account begins to feel like a second income, while Kevin is around $100,000, still building, but no longer on the same trajectory. The most important years will feel like the least important. By year 30, Lucas crosses $1 million, and the system is fully operating, while Kevin is around $150,000, still building. By year 35, Lucas has options, and those options change how he lives, while Kevin is still dependent on his income. By year 40, Lucas is sitting on over $3 million, built from decades of uninterrupted compounding, while Kevin is around $200,000 to $250,000, still working, still dependent on active income. The difference between them is not intelligence, not opportunity, not luck. It is continuity, because Lucas stayed in the system long enough for it to begin working, while Kevin stepped away during the phase when it felt like nothing was happening. Because the real test is not whether you can start. It is whether you can stay when staying feels like nothing is happening. Because that is exactly when it starts.